called Rego Grande, and it is recognized by archaeoastronomers as a solar-aligned site. It looks a bit topsy-turvy in the photograph, but it isn't. Everything is very, very precise. This sloping megalith has been wedged into position with granite wedges. The megaliths that are lying on the ground have had the laterite beneath them hollowed out so that they can't move. Everything about it is purposive. And it turns out that sloping stone with a shadow effect tracks the path of the sun throughout the entire day of the winter solstice. Whereas stones 1 and 2, and stone 1 has a hole cut through it, stones 1 and 2 line up to target the rising point of the sun on the winter solstice. Stonehenge in England is also a solstitially aligned site, and its primary focus is on the summer solstice sunrise. Let's be clear, though, that any site which is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise is also aligned to the winter solstice sunset. The relationships are reciprocal. In the case of Stonehenge, the focus is very much on the summer solstice sunrise. The principal axis runs from Sarsen Stone 16 to the heel stone. If you stand behind Sarsen Stone 16 before dawn on the summer solstice and wait for the sun to rise, you'll find that it rises in direct alignment with the heel stone, which serves almost like the sight on the barrel of a rifle to target the rising point of the sun with astonishing precision. This is the Temple of Karnak in Upper Egypt. Its axis is more than 1 kilometer in length and it's very narrow. But that whole axis is about the marriage of heaven and earth, about ground speaking to sky, because only on the winter solstice at dawn do you get the sun rising perfectly dead center along that axis and sitting on top of a purpose-built gateway at the end of the axis. This is what you see if you get up illegally on the back of the Great Sphinx of Giza. You see the back, of course, of the Sphinx's head. But were you to be up there at the dawn on the summer solstice, the sun would be rising far to the left of the gaze of the Sphinx. Should you be there at dawn on the winter solstice, the sun would be rising far to the right of the gaze of the Sphinx. But if you go there at dawn on the spring equinox, then you see what the Sphinx is all about. That it is about as above, so below, earth whispering to sky, the marriage of heaven and earth, because on that day, the gaze of the Sphinx perfectly targets the rising sun. That's what it's all about. It's connecting earth and sky in this almost ethereal manner. And it's the same at Angkor in Cambodia. That narrow central causeway, stand in the middle of it, watch the sun, wait for the sun to rise. It'll rise up the side of the central tower, and then for a few moments it'll sit right on top of the central tower and light the whole place up like a fairy tale kingdom. Now let's go to Ohio in North America. Yeah, it's the same story. It's earth speaking to sky. It's the marriage of heaven and earth. And this is Serpent Mound, and my wife Santa took this photograph with a drone positioned 400 feet above Serpent Mound. And you can see the coils of Serpent Mound here. And those coils amount to about 1,400 feet in length. And there's the open jaws of the serpent, and in front of them a curious oval earthwork. If we use LiDAR to strip the trees away without actually doing any harm to the trees, we can see that Serpent Mound was built on top of a natural ridge, and there's a pronounced twist to the left of the head of the serpent. And that is purposive, because the head of the serpent targets the setting sun on the summer solstice. And we were able to prove that for ourselves by going there on the 20th and the 21st of June 2017. And with the drone, it's possible to see the head of the serpent and the sun. And as the sun begins to descend, you can see the head almost seeking out the sun. And then as the sun sinks lower into this niche in the horizon, the alignment becomes clearer. And finally, there you have it. Once again, the marriage of heaven and earth, earth whispering to sky, as above, so below. Go north from Serpent Mound, and there are two more really intriguing sites in Ohio. And they are High Bank Works and the Newark Earthworks. I'm only able to say tonight a fraction of what is in the book, and the backup to what I'm saying is in the book. I don't have time to dwell on High Bank at great length, except to make a point. Both High Bank, which is in this diagram on the left here, and Newark on the right, incorporate many geometrical figures. Newark has a great circle, a great square, This circle is called the observatory circle, but this circle is part of a broader diagram which includes an octagon. So it's an octagon-circle combination. And there is an octagon-circle combination at High Bank as well. The mystery is that the octagon-circle combination at High Bank is oriented at exactly 90 degrees to the octagon-circle combination at Newark. We've only known this recently, since proper surveys were done. To do this, to get this 90-degree orientation across a distance of 60 miles between two sites, is a really advanced feat of surveying and geometry and astronomy. And it's there in plain view, and in our culture we hardly notice it today. This is an aerial photograph of the octagon-circle combination at Newark, taken in 1934. Those parts that still survive are now largely contained within a private country club, including an 18-hole golf course, which promotes itself as, quote, unlike any other in the world. It is designed around famous prehistoric Native American earthworks that come into play on 11 of the holes. Well, at one level, it's extremely annoying to see this amazing geometrical and sacred site turned into a golf course. But at another level, I kind of welcome it because it means the site is still there. The problem is that more than 90% of the amazing earthworks of the Mississippi Valley that were documented in the 19th century no longer exist. They were all swept away, plowed under, housing was put on top of them, industrial land was put on top of them. They're just all gone. No wonder we're a species with amnesia when we are willing to just wipe out so much of our past and so much of our story so that we can never reconstruct it. So we're lucky that a few sites have survived, and Newark is one of them. And if you go inside that country club, you can see the scale of the earthworks, truly on a monumental scale, and nicely preserved. At Newark, there is also the Great Circle. And the Great Circle is what we call a true henge. I think everybody's familiar with the word henge, but not everybody knows what it means. A henge is an earthwork. A henge is an earthwork which is defined by a deep ditch with an embankment, a high embankment outside the ditch. That's how we know that these were not used for defense. If your embankment is a wall and your ditch is a moat, you're going to put the ditch outside the embankment, not inside the embankment. And this is the case also at Avebury in the southwest of England, near where I live. It is also a true henge. And when we speak of a stone henge, it's an earthwork with megaliths inside it. An aerial view of Avebury will show what I mean. There are a few of the remaining megaliths. Most were destroyed in the Middle Ages on the orders of the Christian Church. But the ditch is very clear and the embankment outside the ditch, and it's a feature exactly like this that we find in the Great Circle at Newark. We find it also in the Amazon, this paired circle combination at Ramal do Capatara. These are true henges with the embankment outside the ditch. And there are other shapes in the Amazon. One of the most intriguing is at Jacosá, where we find the embankment representing a square enclosing a circle, quite a complicated figure. This is not exactly the exercise that the Greeks called squaring the circle, but it's very much like it. It's the same sort of geometrical and mathematical game. And we know that such a site also existed in Ohio. It was mapped by Squire and Davis in 1848, but it's one of those thousands of sites that no longer exists today. And back to Avebury, just recent archaeology has established that inside what was the southernmost of the two inner circles of megaliths, there once stood a megalithic square as well. So that theme of squares and circles occurs at Avebury in England as well as in the Amazon and in Ohio. If you measure carefully the perimeter of the Great Square at Newark, you will find that the number that you come up with is identical to the circumference of the Great Circle. And if you measure the area of the Great Square, you will find that it is identical to the area of the observatory circle. And again, we've only noticed this recently, when careful measurements were done. It's not obvious to the naked eye. And again, it tells us that very complicated mathematical and geometrical games were being played on an enormous scale by the ancients in the Mississippi Valley. Just like the sun, the moon also has its extreme rising and setting points along the horizon. And again, in a culture dominated by light pollution, which fortunately there isn't so much of in Colorado, we tend not to see the sky and we tend not to observe the celestial bodies. And many of us are not aware that the moon has an 18.6 year cycle, and that in this 18.6 year it will reach certain extremes, which are the maximum and the minimum extreme rising and setting points of the moon. And those, there are 8 key points, unfold over 18.6 years, and then the cycle repeats. Every one of those 8 key points is targeted by the octagon circle combination at Newark, every single one of them. And the principal one is maximum northern moonrise, when the moonrise is in direct alignment with the principal axis of the octagon circle combination. Let's go to Cahokia in Madison County, Illinois, where we see the largest pyramid in the Americas north of Mexico. It's called Monk's Mound. We don't know what the ancients called it. We call it Monk's Mound because a bunch of Trappist monks grew vegetables on its terraces in the 19th century. It is a city of the sun, Cahokia. It's all devoted to the sun. And a model of Cahokia reveals something else, that just to the west of Monk's Mound, a few hundred meters to the west of Monk's Mound, once stood what is called a wood henge, a circle of wooden posts. Actually, archaeologists have excavated the wood henge, and they've even found some traces of the original wooden posts and been able to carbon date them. Interestingly enough, there's a wood henge near Stonehenge in England as well. It's a little bit further away. It's about 3 miles away, and it has also been the subject of recent archaeology. They've now put concrete posts where the original wood henge stood, and here's a reconstruction of the wood henge, and it's all about astronomy and celestial alignments. And that is the case at Monk's Mound as well, where archaeologists have reconstructed the wood henge, and you can go and see that today. Should you go there, what it reveals is that the wood henge in relation to Monk's Mound is all about the marriage of earth and sky, that it targets the summer solstice sunrise, the winter solstice sunrise, and principally the equinox sunrise. So if you go there on any other day of the year, you'll just see something unremarkable, a few posts and Monk's Mound in the background. But at dawn on the spring equinox, the whole place lights up, and you can see that the alignment, what the alignment is all about. Once again, the marriage of heaven and earth. So when we look at monumental earthworks like Serpent Mound, Newark, Cahokia, with their carefully thought through alignments to significant solar and lunar events, I think we're looking at proof that a civilization and spiritual system built around sophisticated observations of the heavens did once flourish in the Americas. And the question is, how far back can this system be traced, and where did it have its origins? Cahokia is not very old. It's about 1,000 years old, but it's part of a system of construction of mound and earthwork sites along the Mississippi Valley that goes back long before 1,000 years ago. For a start, let's go to Poverty Point in southern Louisiana in the lower Mississippi Valley, where again we have a huge pyramidal mound, but what's intriguing is what's next to that mound is these geometrical ridges. And these geometrical ridges have recently been the subject of a detailed archaeoastronomical survey by William Romaine, whose work I cite at some length in America before. And using LiDAR, what he's established is that key sightlines target the summer solstice sunset, the equinox sunset, the winter solstice sunset, the summer solstice sunrise, the equinox sunrise, and the winter solstice sunrise. Again, that theme is repeating itself here. And just about 2 miles south of Poverty Point dates to 1430 BC, about a century before Tutankhamun took the throne in Egypt. So let's say it's 2,500 years old. But a couple of miles south is Lower Jackson Mound, which dates to 3,500 BC. It's 5,500 years old. And there's a gap in the archaeology between Lower Jackson Mound and Poverty Point. Maybe that gap is to do with sites just being demolished and swept away. But it's very clear that those who created Poverty Point 2,500 years ago regarded the 3,000-year-older site of Lower Jackson Mound as extremely important and honored it in their construction, because the 3 principal mounds of Poverty Point are aligned perfectly north-south with Lower Jackson Mound. That's speaking to continuity, to a tradition that continues behind the scenes of history over thousands and thousands of years. Another of these older sites is Watson Brake in southern Louisiana. And Watson Brake is an oval earthwork consisting of multiple mounds. And again, the LiDAR work reveals what it's all about, that it's about alignments to the summer solstice sunset, to the winter solstice sunrise, and to the equinoxes. And as I explain in the book, the very size of the site is defined by these astronomical alignments. There's also shared geometry in the sites of the lower Mississippi Valley, built around equilateral triangles with 60-degree corners. We can trace the mound building tradition way back. We go to Watson Brake. It's already possibly as old as 3,590 BC. Caney mounds could go back to 3,600 BC. Frenchman's Bend, there's the suggestion of a date of 4,610 BC, in other words, almost 7,000 years ago. Hedgepeth Mounds, also about 7,000 years ago. Montesano, 7,000 to 7,500 years ago. Conley, 7,500 to 8,000 years ago. So when we look at the more recent mound building sites, we must realize that they're part of a continuous tradition that goes back into remotest prehistory. And because so much of the archaeology of the Americas has been lost, we don't know how far back before 8,000 years it goes, but it's a fair bet it goes back a long time before 8,000 years ago. If you take a 13-hour, 5-minute flight from Baton Rouge in Louisiana and fly down to the heart of the Amazon, you will find a site that is dated firmly to 13,000 years ago that incorporates all the same astronomical alignments. It's called Pinal do Pilau. It contains cave paintings. Again, the backup is in the book. I won't go into detail here, but its focus is on the winter solstice. There is even a calendar painted on the walls there that marks off the 18 to 20 days before and after the winter solstice. And there are also precise alignments to the equinox sunrise. So again, it's about the marriage of heaven and earth whispering to sky. So this notion, I call it after Richard Dawkins. He invented the phrase a meme. I call these memes cultural aspects that have been passed down by reproduction and replication over thousands of years. We find this as above, so below meme, certainly in the old world. We find it at Stonehenge, we find it at Angkor, we find it at Giza, we find it at Karnak in Upper Egypt, and at many, many other sites. But we also find it in the New World. We find it at Serpent Mound, we find it at Watson Brake, we find it at Rego Grande in the Amazon. It's truly universal, and I suggest that this universal is not a coincidence, that we're looking at a legacy that has been passed down from a remote common ancestral civilization. And I want to be clear, when I speak of the similarities between ancient Egypt and the Mississippi Valley, I'm not talking about an ancient Egyptian missionary expedition to the Mississippi Valley in historical times, or vice versa, a missionary expedition from the Mississippi Valley to ancient Egypt. What I'm suggesting is that both these cultures shared a legacy from a much earlier culture, a remote ancestral civilization, and that legacy expresses itself in the monuments they create and the ideas that surround those monuments. We almost take it in with our mother's milk that civilization is an old world invention, that it's got nothing to do with the new world at all. That's how it's taught in our schools and universities today. I have a book in my shelves called History Begins at Sumer by Samuel Noah Kramer. And he is making the case that Sumer was the origin of the first civilization, Sumer, the ancient Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, and that they were the first to do many things that we recognized as civilized and associated with cities. And so from that view, the origins of civilization are in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And nobody is thinking of North America as having had anything to do with the origins of civilizations. And there are a number of reasons why that thought has never occurred to archaeologists. One of them is to do with the Ice Age. And these enormous ice caps that covered North America during the Ice Age, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice sheets that were joined into one huge ice sheet for very long periods of the Ice Age. While Beringia itself remained ice-free, it was thought to be a completely uninhabitable tundra where nobody could live. And it wasn't until 13,400 years ago, with some global warming, that an ice-free corridor opened up between the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice sheets. And archaeologists speculate that that was the moment that human populations in Siberia took the opportunity to cross the Beringia and down through that ice-free corridor and into North America and thence into Central America and South America. What they're not paying attention to is that there was a similar sweet spot when sea levels were equally lower, when Beringia was a land bridge, when an ice-free corridor opened up between the ice sheets, and that was between 140,000 years ago and 120,000 years ago. And it just seems absurd to archaeologists to suggest that anybody, the human beings, could have entered the Americas then. And for a long time it seemed absurd to geneticists as well. They thought there had only been one founding population of the Americas, but we now know, thanks to that mysterious Australasian genetic signal in the Amazon, that that can't be the case, that we're looking at a much more complicated story, that it's challenging the existing view. And this challenge also touches on the issue of when and how the Americas were first populated. And really it's only in the last 8 or 9 years that scientists have begun to admit, that archaeologists have begun to admit that they kind of got it wrong on the peopling of the Americas. It's one of these things, you know, where they oppose new ideas for decades, and then when the evidence overwhelms it, they say, oh, well, we knew that all along. And that's what they're doing now. But here's New Scientist, 26th of March 2013, Migration Mystery, who were the first Americans? We thought we knew the full story of our last great migration, but new evidence means the issue is wide open again. And I'll just read a bit more. Not so long ago, there was a simple and seemingly incontrovertible answer to the question of how and when the first settlers made it to the Americas. Some 13,000 years ago, a group of people from Asia walked across a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska and headed south. And these people were known as the Clovis culture. And for decades, it was the received wisdom that the Clovis culture were the first Americans. And as New Scientist admits here, so compelling was the Clovis first model that few archaeologists even contemplated an alternative. Some, with the temerity to do so, complained of a Clovis police intent on suppressing dissent. These are the stone tools of the Clovis culture, very fine arrowheads and spearheads with a curious fluting in them. And there are thousands and thousands of these have survived all over North America, and they do date between 13,400 years ago and 12,800 years ago, when the Clovis culture mysteriously disappears. By the way, why do we call it the Clovis culture? We don't know what they called themselves, but the type site is at a place called Blackwater Draw in New Mexico. And the archaeologists who were excavating that rich Clovis site couldn't get beer at Blackwater Draw. But 20 miles down the road at Clovis, New Mexico, they could get they could get beer. So they called the culture the Clovis culture. It's as simple as that. This is what happens when archaeologists challenge the Clovis first model. The Clovis first model set in the 1960s, and it was a rigid dogma of American archaeology through until about 2010. And this is the work of Jacques Cinq-Mars, who excavated Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, thought to have been uninhabitable until 13,400 years ago, between 1977 and 1987. And he found evidence that human beings had been present there for 24,000 years ago, long before Clovis. And as the Smithsonian would subsequently admit, rather than launching a major new search for more early evidence, the finds stirred fierce opposition and a bitter debate, quote, one of the most acrimonious and unfruitful in all of science. Jacques Cinq-Mars likened the experience to being at the hands of the Spanish Inquisition. He was insulted at conferences. He was literally humiliated. He was accused of planting his evidence. He was accused of making the whole thing up, of being a fantasist. His research funding was withdrawn and his field work eventually sputtered and died, but he was right. A re-excavation of the site in 2017 has completely vindicated him. He was correct. Human beings were in Bluefish Caves 24,000 years ago, and Clovis first is dead in the water. As the Smithsonian reluctantly admits, today, decades later, the Clovis first model has collapsed. Then here's another daring archaeologist, Al Goodyear of the University of South Carolina, excavated the richest Clovis site in South Carolina, which is called Topper. But after getting to the bottom of the Clovis level, he decided to challenge the dogma. He decided to dig deeper. This was in 2004. And Al took me to the site and showed me the artifacts they found there, the pre-Clovis artifacts. And his evidence is compelling, more and more widely accepted now, that human beings, there's the Clovis level, there's the level that Al dug down to. He found evidence that human beings had been at Topper 50,000 years ago. So, just as archaeologists are recovering from their state of post-traumatic shock at Bluefish Caves and Topper, appears this report in Nature on the 26th of April 2017, which documents a human presence just south of San Diego 130,000 years ago, 10 times as old as Clovis. As they say here, humans in America 115,000 years earlier than thought. This discovery, which was made by Dr. Tom Demaray, who's the chief paleontologist at the San Diego Natural History Museum, has got archaeologists tying themselves in knots. They're absolutely furious about it. How dare he suggest that human beings could have been in the Americas 130,000 years ago, 60 or 70,000 years ago, before they were even in Europe. Archaeologists just know in their hearts that this has to be wrong. They haven't learned the lesson of the overthrow of Clovis first. There's been a huge negative reaction. It's been a very controversial discovery, but it's a discovery that made its way through the intensely peer-reviewed process and got into Nature in April 2017. And again, Tom spent a day with me and he showed me his evidence. It's compelling, and I set out all the details in America before. The implications are huge. If the Americas have been inhabited by humans for 130,000 years, more than twice as long as Europe, 10 times as long as previously supposed, then our whole understanding of prehistory must change. Not only the prehistory of the Americas, but the prehistory of the entire world. Because what we have in the Americas is a vast resource-rich landmass. And interestingly, Tom Demaray's find, I mentioned there was that earlier sweet spot between 140,000 years ago and 120,000 years ago. It's smack in the middle of that sweet spot. Human beings could have got into the Americas then. I'm not claiming, and nor does Tom Demaray, that they were an advanced civilization, but the very fact that humans were in America 130,000 years ago, and then the Americas get cut off from the rest of the world, raises the possibility that a civilization did evolve here. And then we have the archaeologists who for 60 years refused to look at the older deposits, only looked at the Clovis level deposits and wouldn't go deeper. No wonder that we may have missed this story. But there's another factor, and that's the cataclysm that afflicted North America between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And here I am in this photograph at Murray Springs, in Arizona with geophysicist Alan West. And he is showing me this black stripe along the side of the draw, which is about a handbreadth wide. He's showing me what is called the Younger Dryas boundary layer. It's a distinct stratum in the earth, and it is full of evidence of wildfires burning, of enormous quantities of soot. And right at the base of it are a very complicated mixture of chemical and mineral signatures, which are called impact proxies. Because when you get them in abundance, the only thing that can explain all of them is a cosmic impact, something like a comet or an asteroid hitting the Earth. And they include nanodiamonds. Those nanodiamonds are created in the heat and shock of the impact. They include iridium. They include platinum. They include melt glass, a bit like the trinitite created in nuclear explosions. And here we're looking at the excavation of Murray Springs in the 1960s, and here in the foreground is the carcass of a mammoth, and the archaeologists called her Eloise. And in the shoulder blade of Eloise was found embedded a Clovis point. So we know that she was hunted by the Clovis people. The dating is firm, it's 12,800 years ago. And the black mat, or the Younger Dryas boundary layer, which is also referred to as the black mat, was draped over Eloise like shrink wrap. It seems to capture the moment when the cataclysm began in North America. That's the moment when the Clovis culture vanished entirely from the archaeological story. It's the moment when the megafaunal extinctions begin on a very rapid scale, and Eloise was one of those megafauna. And out of this has evolved what's called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, an attempt to explain the mystery of the Younger Dryas. And there are more than 60 eminent scientists who are behind this work. They're not, pseudo-scientists like Graham Hancock. They're actually real scientists who are courageous and who have stuck their necks out and who have taken a great deal of flack again from our friends the archaeologists, because archaeologists don't like the notion of a cataclysm radically rewriting the human story as recently as 12,800 years ago, but they're suggesting that the Younger Dryas was caused by several large fragments of a disintegrating comet hitting the North American ice cap. Let me just say a word or two about comets and asteroids and cosmic impacts in general. I think it's important to put this into context. We all know today that the dinosaurs were made extinct by cosmic impact. It's thought to be an asteroid or a comet about 10 kilometers in diameter that hit the Gulf of Mexico 65 or 66 million years ago and made the dinosaurs all across the planet extinct. And it too is marked by a boundary layer filled with soot and filled with impact proxies, nanodiamonds, iridium, platinum, and so on and so forth. And actually the father-son team, Lewis and Walter Alvarez, who initially made the discovery, were satisfied with the impact proxies. They didn't even feel they needed to find the crater. The impact proxies on their own proved that there had been a massive cosmic impact 65 million years ago. They went through 10 years of being hounded by their colleagues in science and accused of making stuff up until they found the crater. And the crater is in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's called the Chicxulub crater. And since its discovery, the controversy has gone away, and we all accept that a major cosmic impact was behind the extinction of the dinosaurs. I'm showing this image which shows dinosaurs and a chicken because this was such a world-changing event that it literally turned dinosaurs into chickens. In the sense that the birds are all that's left of the Dinosauria clade. The dinosaurs were swept out of the way, and that was good news for this little shrew-like creature that was skulking in the primeval forests 66 million years ago, a mammal, and the mammals were going nowhere in a world ruled by the dinosaurs. But when the cosmos intervened and kindly swept the dinosaurs out of the way, the mammals began to evolve very rapidly. They began to occupy niches that had previously been closed off to them, and that's why we can say pretty surely, meet your 65 million year old mother. We are all the descendants of that shrew, and we would not be here if a cosmic impact had not changed the geology and the history of the Earth radically 65 or 66 million years ago. NASA likes to be really reassuring. NASA wants us to feel calm. And NASA tells us that these kind of events, these extinction level events, they only occur once every 100 million years. That's incredibly reassuring. If the last one was 65 million years ago, why the next one won't occur for another 35 million years. How nice of the universe to be so Germanic in its timekeeping that we can set our clocks by it in that way. But suppose NASA's wrong. More and more scientists feel that way. They feel that our cosmic environment is much more active than NASA has told us, and they include the late Sir Fred Hoyle, who was Professor of Astronomy at Cambridge University, Chandra Wickram Singh, Victor Klug, Bill Napier, and many others. This is a NASA fact sheet, helpfully explaining what a meteor shower is. All of us have seen meteors. What not everybody is aware of, but NASA makes clear here, is that every meteor shower is the debris trail of a former comet. Every meteor shower is the remnant fragmented debris of a former comet. whether it's the Perseids, whether it's the Leonids, whether it's the Aquarids, whether it's the Orionids, whether it's the Taurids, they all mark the path of a former comet that has broken up into multiple fragments. And NASA says, don't worry, the meteoroids are usually small, from dust particle to boulder size, almost always burn up in the atmosphere, no problem here. It's an odd thing, but there isn't a single culture in the ancient world in which the appearance of a comet in the sky was regarded as good news. It was always regarded as really bad news, as a very bad omen. And I wonder whether there's some collective memory behind that, of an interaction that we had with a comet sometime in the remote past. Certainly, Bill Napier, who's professor of astrobiology at Cardiff University, is convinced that this is so. This is a paper, I don't expect you to read it, of course. He published it, it's too small to read anyway on the screen, but he published it in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society in July 2010, and the title is self-explanatory, Paleolithic Extinctions and the Tattered Complex. He is directly connecting the extinctions of the megafauna during the Younger Dryas to the Tattered meteor stream, which the Earth still passes through twice a year. And I'll just quote here, the evidence, decades old now and not even controversial amongst the comet community, is that an exceptionally large, low inclination, short period comet has been orbiting in our neighborhood for about 20,000 years. In such a disintegrating environment, there's a reasonable probability of a catastrophic encounter with debris in the comet trail. And he is arguing that that comet was originally very large. It was about 100 miles in diameter. It entered the inner solar system because of gravitational disturbances far out in deep space, and it went on an Earth-crossing orbit about 20,000 years ago. And for the first several thousand years ago, there was no problem. The Earth did not collide with the comet, but the comet began to break up into multiple fragments, as comets do. And those fragments began to spread out along the entire course of its orbit, and they began to widen out into multiple filaments. And 12,800 years ago, the calculation is that at least 4 large fragments in the range of 1 kilometer in diameter fell out of the Tattered meteor stream and hit the North American ice cap, creating the onset of the Younger Dryas and the beginning of the megafaunal extinctions. So this is a diagram of the Tattered meteor stream. We already know that it includes large and dangerous objects, of which the most famous is Comet Encke. Comet Encke is about 6 kilometers in diameter, and it is a fragment of the original giant comet that broke up into multiple parts. Likewise, Comet Olgiato, Comet Rudnicki, and 19 of the brightest near-Earth objects are in the Tattered meteor stream. So I liken it a bit to strapping on a blindfold and crossing an 8-lane interstate and just hoping we don't meet any traffic. Or if we do, that it should be, motorcycles rather than trucks. We were given an object lesson about comets in 1994. It was kind of like a spooky message to us. And that was when Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 hit Jupiter. Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 broke up into 21 glowing fragments. And those fragments were drawn down by the colossal gravity of Jupiter, and they smashed into the surface of Jupiter, creating scars larger than the Earth itself. The total explosive power of those impacts has been estimated at 300 gigatons. If you were to take the entire stockpiled nuclear arsenal of the Earth and blow it up all at once, it would yield just 6.4 gigatons. So we have a sense of the enormous scale of these events, and this is the moment where I always say, thank you, Jupiter. Thank you for taking one for the team. Thank you for being the giant guardian of our planet and for stopping most of those bloody comets that keep on winging into the inner solar system. But every now and then a comet gets by, and the evidence is that that's what happened 20,000 years ago, and that 12,800 years ago, fragments of those comets bombarded the Earth. And that's when we see the beginning of the megafaunal extinctions, which unfold over the next 1,200 years between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And these extinctions were global, but they were very much focused on the Americas, where in North America, 70% of the large mammal genera went extinct during the Younger Dryas. We have had an encounter with an object out of the Tattered meteor stream relatively recently. and that was on the 30th of June 1908. And mercifully, it happened over an uninhabited area of Siberia. It's called the Tunguska event. And it was an object that was between 60 and 190 meters in diameter. It didn't even reach the Earth, it actually blew up in the sky. It was an airburst. But it flattened 80 million trees across an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers, which is larger than any major city in the world today. And if this event had happened over a major city rather than over an uninhabited area, I suspect we'd all be paying much more attention to the Tattered meteor stream than we are today, because the Tattered meteor stream is still with us, just as it was 12,800 years ago, and I suggest it's a hidden hand in human history. So while the astronomers have been looking up at the sky, another team of scientists have been looking at the ground, and they're behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And as I say, these are true scientists. James Kennett is a marine geologist. He's professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's a world-renowned expert in paleoceanography. Alan West, geophysicist, I was with him at Berry Springs. Richard Firestone, staff scientist, Nuclear Science Division, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. James Whitke is a geologist. Albert Goodyear is an archaeologist. Altogether, the team consists now of more than 60 scientists. They have been publishing in peer-reviewed journals since 2007. They have met a massive amount of opposition, but the evidence just keeps on mounting. They were initially attracted by the mystery of the Younger Dryas. Why did it happen? What happened was that the last ice age reached its peak about 21,000 years ago. The world was at its coldest then. Then the world began to warm up, and then suddenly, 12,800 years ago, you get this plunge in global temperatures, which brings the Earth back to as cold as it was at the peak of the last ice age. That plunge in global temperatures lasts for 1,200 years, then suddenly global temperatures shoot up again 11,600 years ago. Both at the beginning of the Younger Dryas and at the end of the Younger Dryas, you get sea level rise. You get a release of meltwater into the world ocean. And this is odd, particularly at the beginning of a deep freeze. You would expect that water to stay on the ice caps, not to enter the world ocean. Something caused it to release into the world ocean. Again, I don't expect you to read these papers on the screen, but I just want to show that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is based on solid science and has been published in peer-reviewed journals since 2007. Initially, they were thinking that the date was 12,900 years ago. They've refined it to 12,800 years ago since then. This was the first paper, 9th of October 2007, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Evidence for an extraterrestrial impact 12,900 years ago that contributed to the megafaunal extinctions and the Younger Dryas cooling. Here's another paper from 2009, shock synthesized hexagonal diamonds in Younger Dryas boundary sediments. Evidence, very high temperature impact melt products as evidence for cosmic airbursts and impacts 12,900 years ago. Evidence from central Mexico. A very intriguing large platinum anomaly in the Greenland ice cores points to a cataclysm at the onset of the Younger Dryas. You know, Greenland didn't lose its ice cover at the end of the Ice Age. North America did, Northern Europe did, but Greenland kept its ice cover. And as a result, we can put down tubular drills into that ice and we can extract long cores of ice, and they contain a perfect record of world climate over thousands and thousands of years. And in the layer from the Younger Dryas 12,800 years ago is found this massive quantity of platinum, which really shouldn't be there unless it was brought in by a cosmic impact. Another paper, evidence for deposition of 10 million tons of impact spherules across 4 continents 12,800 years ago. Here's the Journal of Geology, 5th of September 2014. Nano-diamond-rich layer across 3 continents, consistent with major cosmic impact at 12,800 calendar years before the present. Paper from 2015 documenting the extent of the Younger Dryas boundary field as it was then known. It's clear that the epicenter was over North America and Greenland, but there were impacts in Europe, impacts documented as far east as Syria. Picking up that large platinum anomaly in the Greenland ice core from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in August 2013, we have a paper published by Dr. Chris Moore of the University of South Carolina in Nature's Scientific Reports in 2017. He went digging in Younger Dryas sediments all over North America, and what did he find? widespread platinum anomaly documented at the Younger Dryas onset in North American sedimentary sequences. And as Chris notes, platinum is very rare in the Earth's crust, but it is common in asteroids and comets. Two more recent papers from 2018, Journal of Geology, extraordinary biomass burning episode and impact winter triggered by the Younger Dryas cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. And here a question, did the black mat impact airburst reach the Antarctic? Evidence from New Mountain near the Taylor Glacier in the Dry Valley Mountains. In summary, they are demonstrating that the Younger Dryas boundary field is not limited to this 50 million square kilometers, but also extended far to the south, as far south as Antarctica. And here's the most recent paper, again in Nature Scientific Reports, from the 13th of March 2019. Sedimentary record from Patagonia, southern Chile, supports cosmic impact triggering of biomass burning, climate change, and megafaunal extinctions at 12,800 years ago. The evidence for this is all over North America. I went into it in depth in my book, Magicians of the Gods, and I present more recent evidence in America before. Let's focus on one area very briefly, which is the channeled scablands in Washington state. As you can see from this map, the channeled scablands were subjected to some kind of horrendous flooding disaster. They've been torn and ripped apart, leaving these scars on the landscape. And for a very long time, the explanation that was given was that glacial lakes from time to time burst their ice dams and poured their water out over the channeled scablands and gradually created this effect. The new evidence is that this all happened very suddenly and at once. And that yes, glacial lakes were involved because they were rapidly filled up with water pouring off the North American ice cap, pouring into those glacial lakes, causing them to overflow and pouring directly over what we now call the channeled scablands. Part of the evidence for this is a meteorite, the Willamette. I was told that I don't pronounce this correctly. The Willamette meteorite, which is a 15-ton iron meteorite, which was found in Oregon. It's been thoroughly studied. It was brought there in an iceberg on floods 12,800 years ago. It had come from the Canadian ice cap. And here above the town of Wenatchee, 500 feet up the valley side, is this huge glacial erratic, a giant boulder. And I'm there with Randall Carlson, my friend and colleague, done a great deal of research together. That boulder, I'm on top of it there for scale, that boulder is calculated to weigh 18,000 tons. It comes from about 100 miles further north. How did it end up 500 feet up the valley side at Wenatchee? The answer is that it got there in an iceberg the size of an oil tanker. And that iceberg was carried on floods that had to be at least 500 feet deep in order for it to be deposited where it's deposited. It grounded against the valley side, the flood waters receded, the iceberg was left there, the giant rock that it had enchained was exposed as the iceberg melted away, and there it still sits to this day. And it is not alone. There are thousands of these scattered all across the Pacific Northwest, testifying to the enormous forces that unrolled across this landscape, anything that got in the way of those floods, which were filled with icebergs jostling one another, with whole forests ripped up by their roots, with mud and boulders rumbling at the base of these 100 or 1,000 feet deep floods. Anything that got in the way of them would have been pulverized and destroyed. This area is called Boulder Park. There's so many of these giant glacial erratics there. And those floods in just 2 weeks created dry falls, a phenomenal sight, well worth going to visit. And again, I'm there with Randall Carlson, and we're looking at just one small lobe of dry falls, a fossilized waterfall. The water you see in the bottom is just pooled rainwater. There hasn't been any water flowing over this for 12,800 years. It was formed in those floods, and to put it into perspective, let's put Niagara Falls into the picture on the same scale. Niagara Falls is truly tiny by comparison with Dry Falls. And Niagara Falls is still being made by the river. Dry Falls is the work of just 2 weeks of absolutely humongous flooding 12,800 years ago. Nature is fractal. Anything nature does on a small scale, it can also do on a much larger scale. We're all familiar with current ripples on a beach. As the tide goes out, it leaves these nice little ripple patterns. And those ripples may be an inch or so high and a few feet long. But there are current ripples, nobody disputes that that's what they are. There are current ripples on the Camas Prairie in the Pacific Northwest that are of an entirely different order of magnitude. And let's get close up to those current ripples. There's a car in the shot to give you the scale. These current ripples are 50 feet high and 300 feet long. And they testify again to the enormous scale of the flooding that ripped this whole area apart. Outside the work of the Comet Research Group behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, there's been some very interesting work done recently by Antonio Zamora and his colleague Michael Davias. And Zamora is drawing attention to the Carolina Bays. The Carolina Bays have long been suspected to have been created by a swarm of comets or asteroids, but recently they've been rather dismissed, and they're not taken into account even by those who are researching the Younger Dryas mystery. But Zamora has resurrected the whole issue of the Carolina Bays because there is another feature very like them in Nebraska. And that feature, that's a Carolina Bay there, these oval formations. They look like impact craters. There's another feature in Nebraska which is called the Nebraska rainwater basins. The Carolina Bays are oriented northwest to southeast. The Nebraska rainwater basins are oriented northeast to south, North Carolina Bays, northwest to southeast, northeast to southwest in the case of the Nebraska rainwater basins. Very difficult to see the Nebraska rainwater basins from the air, but if you get LiDAR over the sites, you can see the same oval formations that you find in the Carolina Bays. And what it reveals is a triangulation point, and that triangulation point is the so-called thumb of Michigan, in the mitten of Michigan, and an impact there would have sent out objects on trajectories that would have left impacts in the Nebraska rainwater basins and in the Carolina Bays. And the calculations have been done, and it very strongly suggested that even the thumb of Michigan, this Saginaw Bay, is an impact crater. That a large object hit the ice cap 12,800 years ago, and what it sent out was icy ejecta, ice boulders, and those were thrown up into the stratosphere, and they came down in the Carolinas and they came down in Nebraska. And this is, I believe, an area of research that requires much further investigation, because if Zamora is right, he's the first to draw attention to what this would have meant, that the whole of North America, south of the ice cap, would have been covered in an ice blanket about a meter deep, that it would have made the growing of plants impossible, that huge extinctions of animal species would have occurred, and it accounts for the massive scale of the cataclysm that occurred then. There's evidence for impacts over the northeast of North America. A crater has been found in Canada, the Corisol crater, which dates precisely to 12,800 years ago. That, with the impact proxies, should be enough to settle the issue over what caused the Younger Dryas, but there's so much opposition to this idea that the fight goes on. And most recently, this huge impact crater found in Greenland, which is 19 miles wide, on which the press are already reporting dates to about 12,000 years ago. The press are premature in that. The evidence has not yet in on the dating. I would be irresponsible to tell you that it's 12,800 years old. More work needs to be done. The crater has only recently been found. But here's what's sure. Underneath it is only massively disturbed Pleistocene ice, Ice Age ice. Above it is completely untroubled Holocene ice from our geological epoch. It suggests that it was made at the junction of the Pleistocene and the Holocene, the Younger Dryas, 12,800 years ago. It could be the smoking gun. Let's wait for the research to confirm that. At any rate, it's called the Hiawatha Glacier Crater. It's in Greenland, and we can see how close Greenland really is to North America, and this whole area was the epicenter of the Younger Dryas cataclysm. Why did the world get so cold at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and why did sea level rise suddenly then? The answer is that meltwater didn't only pour south over North America, but it also poured into the Atlantic Ocean. And in the Atlantic Ocean, it stopped the Gulf Stream dead in its tracks. And the Gulf Stream is part of the central heating system of our planet, the global meridional overturning circulation, which swaps warm and cold waters and keeps the planet warm, that was shut down 12,800 years ago by that icy meltwater. That's why the world became so cold. That's why the extinctions began. And then as to the end of the Younger Dryas, another massive flood, which geologists call meltwater pulse 1b. As early as the 1980s, Fred Hoyle, who was then professor of astronomy at Cambridge University, was intrigued by that massive temperature rise and flooding 11,600 years ago. And he proposed again that a comet had been involved, but this time the comet had not hit an ice cap, it had hit a major ocean. It had caused enormous tidal waves. A huge cloud of water vapor had been thrown up into the upper atmosphere, created a greenhouse effect, caused the warming that ended the Younger Dryas and created what the geologists call meltwater pulse 1b. The science on the beginning of the Younger Dryas is much better than the science on the end of the Younger Dryas. But one thing's sure, the Younger Dryas did end abruptly 11,600 years ago. Global temperatures soared, the remaining ice caps very rapidly collapsed into the sea, and there was a dramatic pulse of sea level rise that, as I mentioned, geologists nominate as meltwater pulse 1b. And this is the moment when I ask, and again I go into much more detail in the book, could North America, could Turtle Island, as the Native American peoples called North America, could Turtle Island be Atlantis? Let's consider that possibility. Where do we get the story of Atlantis from? There is only one original source for the story of Atlantis, and that's the Greek philosopher Plato. Every other account of the story of Atlantis is derivative of Plato, and so Plato is the primary surviving source. And interestingly enough, Plato tells us when Atlantis was submerged, and that is 11,600 years before our time, 11,600 years ago. It coincides exactly with meltwater pulse 1b. And if Plato made the whole story up, as archaeologists accuse him of doing, he was astonishingly on the money with the latest geological evidence of sea level rise at the end of the Younger Dryas. And here's how we know that date. Plato got the story through his family line, through his ancestor, the famous Greek lawmaker Solon, who visited Egypt in 600 BC. And there at the temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta, a temple that no longer exists, he met Egyptian priests who told him, he said, the story of Atlantis, and told him of this great civilization that had been destroyed in a flood cataclysm. And Solon asked the priests, when did this happen? And the priests replied very matter-of-factly, 9,000 years ago. That was in 600 BC. In our calendar, that's 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. That is meltwater pulse 1b. A striking coincidence, if it's a coincidence. And of course, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. Plato tells us that Atlantis had advanced architecture, advanced agriculture, advanced navigational shipbuilding and seagoing skills, advanced social and political organization, that it was once a beautiful culture dedicated to the nurture of spirit. But the worm of corruption entered in, that Atlantis became cruel, it became arrogant, it became conceited, it began to impose its power on other less powerful peoples around the world. It became a dominator culture, and in a ringing phrase, it ceased to carry its prosperity with moderation. That's the state of mind that the Greeks called hubris, and in Greek thought, hubris was always punished by nemesis. The suggestion is that Atlantis was struck down by the universe because of its hubris, because of its conceit, because of its arrogance, because of its cruelty. And interestingly, Plato tells us that it was not primarily the citizens of Atlantis who survived that cataclysm. It was those other less powerful people around the world, the meek of the earth, the hunter-gatherers, the herdsmen, and the shepherds who coexisted with the Atlantean civilization. And what he says is that those who survived were those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And so you have to begin all over again like children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times. I don't mean to spread gloom and doom, and I won't do so, but I'm near the end of the talk now, probably 10 minutes away. If there's doubt about the origins of civilization, there's also doubt about its future. NASA's notion of 100 million year intervals between extinction level events is complacent and irresponsible. NASA says that we live in a safe environment, that every single asteroid that is spotted that crossed the orbit of the Earth, not one of them will hit the Earth in the next 100 years. And that is true. But the problem is the ones it hasn't spotted, the ones that keep whizzing by between the Earth and the Moon that we only see after they've gone past, which are estimated to number approximately 100,000 potentially hazardous objects crossing the orbit of the Earth. And scientists are beginning to wake up to this, that we might not live in such a safe era as we imagine. And it's as though we're getting wake-up calls from the universe. I won't read these headlines, but these are all headlines documenting near misses with asteroids in the last 6 years. 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. Loads of them in 2017. More in 2018. More in 2019. This paper is published on the 25th of March 2019. It documents an airburst over the Bering Straits that wasn't noticed at the time because the area is uninhabited. It took place on the 18th of December 2018. 2 days later, on the 27th of March 2019, 2 days after this report was published, we hear of a giant 1,115-foot asteroid that just skimmed past the Earth. And now, I made this slide a few days ago. It's not 3 days ago now, it's about 9 days ago. NASA announced that it's going to war game an asteroid impact. It is going to pretend an asteroid is about to smash into the Earth and see what can be done about that. You have to wonder what's going on behind the scenes. What is NASA not telling us? What is this little leak of information about? The scientists behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, however, are convinced that our attention should be primarily focused on the Tattered meteor stream, which we still pass through twice a year, for 12.5 days in June and for 12.5 days in November. They regard this unique complex of debris as undoubtedly the greatest collision hazard facing the Earth at the present time. They calculate that there are between 1 and 200 asteroids of more than 1 kilometer in diameter orbiting within the Tattered meteor stream. And they urge the world of government to pay attention to the Tattered meteor stream and to do something about it, because it doesn't have to happen. That's the good news. We are a highly technological civilization, and we have reached the level of technology where it would be possible for us to sweep our cosmic environment clean. Right now, that technology is being looked at purely in commercial terms, in terms of mining asteroids. But if we can mine them, we can move them. All it would take would be a concerted global effort. Human beings would have to actually cooperate with one another. As Newsweek says, asteroids, they can be stopped, but someone has to pay. And the problem is, do we have the will to pay? We certainly have the will to stump up trillions of dollars for weapons of mass destruction. We are ready to invest almost endlessly in warfare and in ever more sophisticated ways to murder one another on a gigantic scale. But are we willing to invest in protecting the environment of the Earth and protecting our cosmic environment? Very reluctant. That needs to change. The choice is ours. It does not have to happen. The last two slides. On the left, if you live in one of these great industrial technological cities of the world today, you'll almost never see the sky because of light pollution. But if you're up in a NASA satellite looking down at the Earth, you can see that in certain parts of the Earth, the lights have been left on all night. Like, for example, in Northern Europe here, which glows like a string of jewels when viewed from space. That's because these are highly technological societies that are fully electrified and that are burning electricity all the time. But if you go down to the Sahara Desert inhabited by hunter-gatherers, or to the Namibian Desert inhabited by hunter-gatherers, there's almost no electricity at all. Hunter-gatherers don't use or need electricity, and that's why they're dark at night, unlike the industrialized countries. Same in the Americas. There's Europe glowing on one side of the Atlantic, there's North America glowing on the other side of the Atlantic, and then there's the Amazon rainforest, almost completely dark, inhabited by hunter-gatherers who don't need or use electricity, including hunter-gatherers who don't even know we exist, the uncontacted tribes. This group were actually photographed from a helicopter in the Brazilian state of Acre, where those geoglyphs are now being found. Nobody knew they existed. They didn't know we existed. They look up one day and see this horrible object hovering in the sky above them, making a fantastic noise, and they fire their arrows at it, but it doesn't do much good. And they think, what the hell was that? You know? I suggest that the world of 12,800 years ago, the Ice Age world, was a bit like our world today. There was an advanced civilization in that world, and there were hunter-gatherers in that world. Now ask yourselves this. If we were to face another cataclysm on the scale of the Younger Dryas events, who would survive? Would it be us, the spoiled children of the earth, the inhabitants of the industrial technological societies? Not many of us know how to survive at all. A few do. I reckon Joe Rogan would get through okay, you know. But I admit, I don't have survival skills, and most people I know don't have survival skills. And where our societies thrive is on the complex, interrelated network of skills that people bring together. We're specialists, we're not generalists. And that creates a strong industrial society, but it also creates a fragile society, because if anything goes wrong, suddenly it's a society with huge populations that don't know how to survive. Most of us aren't aware that those supermarket shelves groaning with food, that the food supply into the cities is on a just-in-time basis, that every city has about 3 days' supply of food. Cut that off. Within a week, people are very hungry. Within a month, they're starving. Within 3 months, there's utter chaos and total devastation, a kind of Walking Dead scenario. We are not psychologically prepared for a cataclysm. We've had it too easy for too long. And we're not ready for it, but who would survive? I think our civilization would go down. It would be a lost civilization. It would vanish from the story of the earth. But who would survive would be the hunter-gatherers who live in the world with us today, who are masters of survival. That's what they're all about surviving in difficult circumstances. They would get through such a cataclysm practically unscathed. And it would be their descendants who would pass down the human story to the future. And I like to think of a time, say, 12,000 years from now, when there might even be a new generation of archaeologists in the world then. And they would be aware of ancient myths, which they would write off as total fantasies. And these ancient myths would speak of a time when there was a great advanced civilization on this planet. They were so advanced, they were almost like gods. They could send people to the moon. They could fly around the planet. They could speak to one another on these magical devices. They could see each other's faces on the other side of the world and talk to each other. They were almost superhuman in their powers, but they became arrogant. They became cruel. They began to impose their will on other less powerful peoples around the world. The worm of corruption entered into their societies. They became over-materialistic. They ceased to carry their prosperity with moderation, and the universe struck them down. So let's make sure we're not the next lost civilization. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.